Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is Technique Tuesday. So what we're going to do today is compare three types of increases: the knit front back, the make one increase, and the lifted increase. These are the three most commonly used types of increases. There are absolutely other types of increases. We're going to focus on these three types. Knitters are often looking for the most invisible increase, and what I want to show you is that different increases can be more visible or less visible in different situations when you're working with different stitch patterns. So what we're going to look at is first, where are these increases in terms of placement? Where are they relative to existing stitches in the fabric or on the needles when you're creating them? Then we're going to take a look at what they look like in the fabric in each of these three different stitch patterns that we have. We're going to talk about the limitations that certain increases might have, as well as their superpowers. And then finally, we're going to look at them in terms of how you might select or make a substitution in a pattern if you don't want to use the increase that they're calling for, if you want to substitute it with something else, things that you might have to think about. So let's dig in. So I have knit 2 stitches right now, and now I want to do a knit front back increase. A knit front back requires an existing stitch. So you are transforming an existing live stitch on the needle, one stitch, you're transforming that into 2 stitches. So you knit into the front of a stitch just like you would normally, but rather than letting it off the needle, you swing your needle, right needle tip to the back, and you work through that stitch a second time. And then now you've got 2 stitches. You still have a new stitch in that existing column of stitches. And then you have your new stitch to the left. It's always to the left, and it looks like a purl bump. So that requires the use of an existing stitch in order to create the new stitch. Now we're going to do a make one increase. And in the last Technique Tuesday video, I showed 3 different ways that you can create a make one increase. One of the standard ways is to lift this running thread that's between 2 stitches. So you're not working with an existing stitch, you are lifting a strand between stitches onto the needle, and then you work that lifted strand in order to create a new column of stitches. And you want this to be twisted, and so it's worked through the back, and then you get this twisted stitch. So you've created a new stitch without using an existing stitch. Now there are other ways of doing the make one increase, which I would suggest you go watch that video. In fact, all of these increases that I'm showing you today, I have full tutorial videos explaining all sorts of things about these increases, how you might use them, advantages, disadvantages, all that sort of thing. The next one is the lifted increase. For this one, you are creating a new stitch in an existing stitch, but that stitch is not on the needles, it's in the fabric, and it's below the needles. So there's a right and a left lifted increase. Depends on whether you're doing a right or a left, how far below the needle that you have to go. So I've just worked a stitch. I worked an old stitch off the needle, and now I have a new stitch on the needle. And so I would lift the leg of the stitch 2 rows below the needle here. I would lift it up, and then I would knit it. I'm knitting through the back so that it doesn't twist. And that creates, so now we've got 2 stitches coming out as well, but we used a stitch in the fabric in order to create it. If we were going to do a right leaning increase of this kind, we'd only have to come 1 row below the needle and lift it up, and then we could work that one. And now we work the stitch that was existing on the needle there. So I've actually done 2 increases side by side in this. So we've got using a live stitch, increasing between live stitches, or using a stitch below the needle to create the new stitch as the 3 different ways of doing increases. For each increase, visibility varies depending on the stitch pattern. So this is the one with knit front back. When you work a knit front back in, say, like you need to do some increases in the last row of ribbing, if you do a knit front back in the last knit stitch before a purl stitch, that new stitch is going to look like a purl bump, and it's just going to hide in there. And what's even better is that on the reverse side, it's going to be the same way. I have 2 knit stitches here, and now I have 3 purls over there. So if you had to do your last row of ribbing on the wrong side, it's going to be just as invisible on the right side of the work. So for me, this is the most invisible increase that you can use in ribbing. It really hides. It's perhaps the most visible increase in stockinette stitch. Because it creates what looks like a little purl bump on the surface of the fabric. So you might like that and want to use that in a decorative way, but if you're trying to hide your increases in your stockinette fabric, it's not going to work with a knit front back. The other thing that you need to think about with knit front back is that because you're working it in a stitch and the new increase, the bump, occurs to the left, if you're doing it like symmetrical at the edges on either side, I've got 3 knit stitches and then you can see the bumps all the way up. I did knit 2, and then in the 3rd stitch I did the knit front back, so the bump occurs to the left of the 3rd stitch. But at the other end of the row, you don't work the knit front back into the 3rd stitch because it ends up to the left, and so you'd only have 2 stitches. So instead, you'd have to do what I did here, which is I had 4 stitches remaining on the needles, then I worked my knit front back, I got that bump, and then I had 3 stitches left to work. So you have to think a little bit about placement when you're using knit front back in a mirrored situation. In garter stitch, it hides pretty well, although you can see, because we've got these ridges of garter, the knit front back creates that little bump kind of in the valley where all the other knit stitches are. It hides pretty well. But it is maybe a little disruptive. However, on the flip side, you can't see it at all because it just creates what looks like a purl bump in the purl stitches, just like it did for the ribbing. It worked really well. So if you have a situation where you have a right side and a wrong side for your garter stitch, you could do your knit front backs on the wrong side of the work and they would look just fine on the right side. But if you have to do your increases on the right side, it's going to be a little bit of a blip. Make one increases are pretty versatile and they're kind of just as well hidden. They're similarly invisible in just about every stitch pattern situation. If you look for it, you can see the little twist at the base of the new column of stitches. In stockinette, sometimes you can get a little pinhole at the base depending on which type of make one increase you're using and what your tension controls are. There are 3 different ways of doing a make one increase, and you can use those different techniques to your advantage if you're having tension issues in order to control those. And that's in that video that I did a couple of weeks ago where I explained that. So they hide similarly as well in garter stitch. If when you look for it, you can see the little blips. They don't quite look like purl bumps. You see like this angled strand instead of something that looks like a purl bump, like right here is where I did a make one. So it hides reasonably well. With the lifted increases, I find that you can get an okay result regardless of what you're doing, but I find that in many knit purl fabrics, it's kind of a pain to do, and it can be somewhat visible. So it's not my preference to do this in ribbing. I did it a couple of different ways to see, the best placement. Here, I was lifting one of the knit stitches to create a purl, and it's a little bit wonky. Here, I lifted the leg of a knit stitch and created a new knit stitch, so I ended up with 3 knits. I think that's somewhat visible. And over here, I lifted the purl bump to create a purl stitch to the right, and they were all okay. But I just think there's better choices. In stockinette fabric, however, I think this is the most invisible increase that you could choose. It's really, really beautiful. Garter stitch, again, it's okay, but it's, you know, it's a little disruptive. You can kind of see it. I think, again, there are better choices in garter stitch for increases other than the lifted increase. So I would suggest that regardless of what kind of stitch pattern you have, that you do swatches and you see what kind of increase are you going to be happiest with in your stitch pattern in your project, because there isn't going to be a perfect answer that was going to work in every situation. The knit front back is really useful when you are starting with a very small number of stitches and you need to basically double your stitch count. So you would be doing a knit front back into every single stitch, and maybe 2 rows later you might be doing a knit one, knit front back. So you're really expanding your stitch count in those first few rows. Knit front back tends to be the go-to increase for that. So if you're starting with just a small number of stitches, like in a pinhole, and you are really trying to increase the number of stitches, it's going to be so gathered up at that starting point that you're not going to see these bumps are not going to be like obviously disruptive to the fabric because it's so bunched up to begin with. I believe the Musselburgh hat starts this way, where you start with knit front back increases at the beginning, and then you switch to a different type of increase as you have more space between stitches. So the knit front back is really good for that. The make one increase tends to be my go-to increase because there are 3 different approaches to how to use it that you can use to deal with any tension issues that you might have. So this one tends to be my basic increase that I'm going to use when I'm working with knit purl stitch patterns, for example. And I'm increasing in pattern while I'm maintaining it. I tend to use this increase. And it also is really flexible in terms of if you have to do quite a number of them. If you do the yarn over version that you then work as twisted on the next row, you have a little bit more slack between the stitches. I wouldn't use the one where I'd have to lift the existing running thread, because that's going to pull slack out of the adjoining stitches, and the more that you have to do in a given row, the more that's going to distort everything. But it is flexible because there are so many ways that you can add slack to the stitches as you're creating them, if that is something that you need. So I find it to be an all-around good basic increase. The lifted increase, I demonstrated where in that first section where I did side-by-side increases. And what's so great about the lifted increase is the ability to do that, where you can create 2 new stitches that are side by side without having a gap or a hole at the base. So if you tried to do 2 side by side make one increases, you would have this kind of gap or pinhole, or it would almost look like a yarn over at the base, because you're trying to create 2 new columns of stitches between 2 existing columns. And in order to do that, it's got to create space underneath. But the lifted increases, because they're lifting up something from a row below, they're filling in that gap as those stitches are being created. This is an example of a project where those kinds of side-by-side increases are done. So we've got this sea of purl stitches, and then we want to create these cables. So we have to increase the number of stitches, and we can do those in these side-by-side increases, and then these ropes just kind of grow out of the fabric. Now there is a limitation to lifted increases. Along here I was doing a lifted increase in that 3rd stitch every time, and the new stitch was coming off to the left here. So it was the same original stitch that was being increased each time. When you pull from that row below and up, you can't do that super often. You typically need maybe 4 rows between when you do that. Otherwise, you're going to kind of limit the amount of stretch that you get in those edges. On the other hand, if you're always doing it in the 3rd stitch, but the new stitch is like coming to the right of here, then you would be doing it a little bit differently. You wouldn't be always doing it in the same stitch. So you can swatch and decide, do I want my increases to come out this way, or do I want to do them that way so that I have more stretch in this direction? The real superpower that the lifted increases have is that they look a lot like a knit two together or an SSK upside down. So if you are reversing the shaping of something, these are really good increases to use when you are reversing the shaping of decreases, because they look so similar. Other increases, they just don't look like a decrease when you look at it upside down. I mean, you can see that the stitches have been eliminated, but it doesn't really look like a knit two together. When you are making substitutions, if you want to swap out whatever increase the pattern calls for and use a different type of increase, you need to pay attention to how the instructions are telling you to work the increase. And keep that in mind when you are making the substitution. Ultimately, what you want is the new stitch to be in the same position as the new stitch is in the original instructions. So let's say we have 25 stitches on the needles, and our instructions are what we see on the screen. It's telling us to do a knit 4 stitches, then do a knit front back, and to repeat that all the way across the row until there's 5 stitches left on the needle, and then you're just going to knit those until the end of the round. The number of stitches that you would end up with would be 29 stitches. So if we look at this representation, and we are thinking about it in terms of going from right to left, because the stitch on the right would be the first stitch that we would work. You can see I've got 4 V's here, and then in bold I've got a V with a dash. So the regular V's are the 4 knit stitches, and then the V with the dash is the knit front back. And so you do that again, and then you've got a knit front back. What you will see is that you end up with 5 knit stitches and then an increase, then the actual increase, 5 knit stitches, and then the little bump, 5 knit stitches, the bump, etc. So you end up with 4 extra stitches. If we want to use a make one increase or a lifted increase instead, we can't just do knit 4 and then do a make one, knit 4, do a make one, or knit 4, do a lifted increase, knit 4, because we would end up with 30 stitches. And that's because we would have 4 knit stitches, and then we'd have our increase, and we'd have 4 knit stitches, and then our increase. Instead, you have to think about the fact that the knit front back is both a knit stitch and the increased purl bump looking stitch. So in order to make that substitution, you would have to knit 5 stitches and then do your make one or lifted increase, knit 5 stitches and then do your knit 1. On the flip side, if the pattern is calling for lifted increases or make one increases and you want to substitute knit front back instead, if the instructions said knit 5, make 1, and then repeat until the last 5 stitches and then knit to the end of the row, you would work the knit front back in that 5th stitch in order to end up with 5 stitches in a row plus the increase. When you want to make these kinds of substitutions, it can be helpful to draw this out like I did, to kind of think about, well, what am I going to have and what's it going to look like, and how do I make it look like that if I want to use this other increase? You can kind of use these techniques that I use for how stitches can be represented visually. You can find complete tutorial videos on all of the increases I talked about today in this playlist of increases and decreases here on my channel. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.